Well, good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, host of the weekly podcast, Life Along the Merrimack. We talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. And sometimes we have very knowledgeable guests on, and today is one of those days. I'm with Bill Sargent, an author and an authority on elements related to the Atlantic and to the river. Bill, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
You know, you've written a great deal about Plum Island and the Atlantic. Your recent book is more about the Merrimack River rather than the ocean. Right. What were your thoughts about going to do something about the river? And perhaps you could mention the name of the book and a little about what it's about.
Yeah, sure. The book is 20,000 Years on the Merrimack River. And actually, the reason I wrote it is when I was out on Plum Island, you would see all kinds of things. You'd see beautiful purple sand, garnet sand. You'd see syringes. You'd see discs from wastewater treatment plants. And of course, we had the CSOs, the combined sewer overflows. And it was sort of to find out where all of those things were coming from that I decided to concentrate on the Merrimack River. And of course, everybody is thinking about the Merrimack River now because people are concerned about the combined sewer overflows. I also like to, and what I try to do in this book, is not so much think of the Merrimack River as sort of the end of a sewer pipe, but it's an incredible natural resource, and if we clean it up, it would help the whole economic development of this area.
Well, one element about the Merrimack that's interesting, it's 117 miles long. Now, many of us down here in Newburyport, we're at the end of the line, but it goes 117 miles way into New Hampshire, and there's a lot of kayaking, there's a lot of boating, there's great recreation all along. And Bill, recently some public officials took a kayak trip down 117 miles, and they ended up here in Newburyport. That brought quite a bit of attention to the river.
Yes, and that was good attention, I think, but that really showed the attention on the river as a resource, not as a sewer pipe.
Mm-hmm. And one of the Bill writes a column in local papers, and one of his columns referenced something that occurred in Boston in the early 80s, that public officials there saw that the Boston Harbor had a great deal of effluent and pollution in it, and many of those people got organized, and they started cleaning up Boston Harbor, much of it through private money. Could you talk a little about that, starting from 1982, I believe?
That's right, and what they had to do is they had to create the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. And the reason for that is Boston Harbor, the sewage department, had been under the MDC, the Metropolitan District Commission, and it was on the bottom of everybody's priorities. And actually Boston water, ratepayers were paying the lowest rates in the country. So what they could do by creating this independent authority is that they could raise the water rates independently. So that gave them the money to be able to do the cleanup. And of course, that has come back in droves. It is, the land values around Boston Harbor are way up now because it's been cleaned up.
Well, one of the elements from the early 70s, Senator Ed Muskie and Senator Ted Kennedy, they were capable of getting the Clean Water Act through in the early 70s. That was federal money, and that was very useful. Do you think we're at a moment where federal money is going to come along, or is that going to be a difficult sell?
It's going to take some time, and I think it's going to be difficult. But I think and I think our local representatives are doing the right thing. They're setting up this commission that will have the political clout to try to get some of that federal money.
And Bill is, I believe, talking about the Merrimack River Commission, which was started recently. It has local, state, federal employees. It has private industry as well, people from Rotary, people from Chamber of Commerce. I believe the first time around they got $50,000 to get it started, but it didn't get approved in the final budget. Now again, I understand it's in the state Senate, and hopefully it'll get through again because, as you say, I attended one of those events where 50 or 60 people, everybody there had something important to say, and as you indicate, this was a political get-together that made it seem like momentum is possible.
Right, right.
And so those are one of the things.
And you don't need that much money because almost all the people there are getting paid anyway. I mean, it's part of their job to be there. Mm-hmm. So you're not paying them to be there, but you're paying to run the commission.
You know, you suggested, you were talking about what Boston did years ago. In Portland, Maine, they were having pollution problems in Casco Bay just because there were sewer overflows. And one thing they did is start what they call the rain tax. And, you know, you get these overflows because the pipes taking the rain runoff mix with the pipes of the sewage treatment plant, so you get sewage and rainwater put together. The idea is to separate those two. And Portland was able to start a taxing authority, and they started a program to separate the rain runoff from the sewage treatment plant. And I think this is working well in Portland.
Yeah.
Could it happen here, Bill?
I think it could, sure, absolutely.
And I understand that, you know, in terms of developments, Manchester, New Hampshire has reportedly just agreed to a program where when they have overflows, they're going to alert people downriver. I don't know exactly how that's going to work out, but Manchester is one of the biggest polluters on the river, so it's got to be good.
I call them the black hole of the Merrimack River because they've always, everybody else reports how much CSOs they've had. Not on a particularly timely basis, but at least it's, you know, within a few months. They wait until January of the following year, you know, and after all the storms have occurred and after there's nothing you can do about it. And then they usually have, you know, one of the largest amounts of CSOs. So each one of the things I try to do in the book is look at each community and look at how they've affected the river.
Well, Mayor Donna Holliday here in Newburyport is working with Boston University and some state money to get a warning system going.
Right.
And so that could be very useful. I'm sure it would take some time. They were actually talking about using flags on the waterfront, which sounds a little 18th century to me, but nevertheless, you know, it's a start. And one of the things, it strikes me, Bill, about the Merrimack River, we talked, it goes 117 miles up, and it's been having its challenges for 200 years because the Industrial Revolution with textiles started in Lowell in about 1821, moved to Lawrence when they built the town around the buildings, the mills. So it's had a lot of pollution over the years, but you know, it's made a comeback and right now is vibrant. Do you think this can happen again?
I do, and actually, one of the things that I try to do in the book is look at all of the inputs. So going back to, you know, lumbering was one of the initial industries around the river, and what they would do is they would cut the trees closest to the river, and that would create erosion, and you'd get a lot of turbidity, and of course the reason that you know, trees were about the only thing they had to sell. You know, do you know the difference between Vermont and New Hampshire? Vermont grows grass and New Hampshire grows trees. It's because they have that granite soil as opposed to the alkaline soil that you have in Vermont. So that's why you have all the cows and you have the milk and you have the grass and you have Bernie Sanders and everything else.
Well, I'm with Bill Sargent, who's an author. He has written much about Plum Island. His latest book is about the Merrimack River. Let's talk about erosion in Plum Island a little bit. As Plum Island made a bit of a comeback 3 or 4 years ago, several houses actually fell into the ocean. About 24 more were condemned. Are things a little better out there than they were 3 or 4 years ago?
I think we're starting to make better decisions out there. But also, the other thing that's happening is we were at the peak of our high tides in 2015. and the tides are on about a 30-year cycle. So the tides now are about a foot lower than they were in 2015. In 2030, they'll be another foot lower, and then they'll start going up again. So we have about a 20-year reprieve where our odds of having erosion events are less than they will be after that. So we should do the right things now, because it's going to really hit us when they start going up again.
Well, talking about developments and erosion along the river, one thing I've been a little puzzled by is the development of Waterfront West in Newburyport. That's on 5 acres of land between Michael's Harborside and the Old Black Cow restaurant, and that's moving forward. But as I remember, that used to be considered low-lying area, and I think about that when I think of groups called Storm Surge and the Municipal Resiliency Committee.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, now that you had mentioned that we may, in a decade or two, have higher tides, what is it wise to be building Waterfront West, or is it just fine and everything's going to work out in the end?
No, I think it's foolhardy, because we'll probably be able to sneak by for maybe 10 years, but after that, the tides are going to start going up, and when people talk about sea level rise, they're actually usually talking about the tides. Because when you're talking about sea level rise, you're talking about maybe 3 inches in the next 20 years. But you could have tides that are 2 feet higher or 2 feet lower during that same amount of time.
When we talk about the environment here in Massachusetts, your father, Francis Sargent, was governor of Massachusetts from 1969 to 1975. Now, he was known as an environmentalist, albeit early in the day.
Right.
Do you think his positions and his career had some effect on your interest in the future?
I'm sure they did. I was one of those kids who never got out of my bug stage. I was always interested in marine biology and have sort of pursued that. He did some really incredible things. One of them was stopping the Southeast Expressway, and what was important about that, I've told a lot of activists, and they said, well, this was a big fight that they had, and I've said, well, you did some really great work, but it really wasn't that hard to change his mind, because he didn't really want to build that anyway. But then not only did he stop the highway, but he convinced the federal government that the monies for the federal highway system should go into public transportation. And that we were the first state to do that, and that made a huge difference.
Well, similarly, in Newburyport, Newburyport was one of the first communities to use federal money for urban renewal, not to take down the old buildings, but to
preserve them,
to renovate them, and I think we all gained from that. But one of the issues that must have been difficult for your father was, I think he was governor during the busing in the early 70s and mid-70s. That must have been a challenging moment. Do you remember much about that era?
I was in college, and I was in my college bubble, so I wasn't that aware of it.
Well, one of the this is Life Along the Merrimack. I am Dyke Hendrickson, the host. I'm with Bill Sargent, an author of numerous books, a columnist here locally, has been an advisor to NOVA and to Woods Hole. He has numerous scientific credentials. But let's talk about publishing for a moment, Bill. Sometimes you do your own publishing, and by that I mean you are the publisher, you get the book published. Why do you do that rather than, say, going to a commercial publisher?
Well, I started with the commercial guys. I was with Houghton Mifflin and Knopf and Norton, and they were great. And you had a company behind you, but I'm actually doing better self-publishing, and you have to write, and what I try to do is I write a local book, because a local book is a better book because it's tighter, and you could just write a better book. But then you can market it locally. And one person can do that. You know, if you have 5 or 6 stores that sell several hundred copies, that's much better than if you have to sell to, 40 or 50 stores across the country, and that's difficult for a single person to do.
And sometimes you appear at events, as you indicated, where there's a captive audience. And I would mention today is Tuesday, August 20th. And a historian from Newburyport, Glee Woodworth, is speaking at the Newburyport Library tonight from 7 to 8. She's talking about shipbuilding here in Newburyport, and I don't know if this would be an event that you would appear at or not necessarily.
I might go. I might go. I actually have something else that I was planning to do, but now that you mention it, I might go. And actually, I have a chapter in the book about the shipbuilding here, and of course, McKay got his start here in the Courier shipyard, and then he moved to East Boston. And of course, the McKay Clippers were the big thing of the of the 1800s. And what they would do is they would use lumber coming down the Merrimack River. They would build these beautiful ships. They would then sail from New York all the way around South America to San Francisco. And then from San Francisco, and then they would drop off people who were looking for gold, and then they would continue on to China, and they would pick up tea, and then they had to get the tea back to London while it was still fresh. So I think this is where you get so it was very important to have a fast ship, and I think this is where you get the expression "a slow boat to China," because you didn't want a slow boat to China.
But, even today, that's such an incredible distance. But 2 centuries ago, with no motors and, just sail, it really was quite an event.
Yeah.
And we were saying last week that there is a monument right here on Merrimack Street honoring the Dreadnought, which was a clipper ship in the 1850s. It held the world record at the time for going across the Atlantic in 9 days. And that is on Merrimack and Ashland Streets. So, there is some memory of that.
Yeah.
And you touched on one thing that I've often thought about. Newburyport was as prominent as any city in the 18th century in shipbuilding. And one reason was because we had access to lumber. With 117-mile river, and many communities, such as Essex or Ipswich, did not have that river running so far away. So, you reminded me that the access to lumber was very important.
Yeah, and then actually, then some Boston businessmen built the Middlesex Canal, and that was able to get lumber from the Merrimack down to Boston, and that kind of put Newburyport out of business for the shipbuilding.
Yeah, people always, kind of wonder, because Samuel Eliot Morison, who was the premier historian of the last century, said that bar none, Newburyport at one time was the leading shipbuilder in the colonies.
Right.
Now, this would be 1790 to 1810 or so.
Yeah.
So I think your point is good about the new canal. The other thing that, strikes me is as the ships got larger, we have a very shallow entrance to the harbor. And I've always read that, as the ships got larger, they might be able to be built and get out into the ocean. But if they came back fully loaded, it was very hard to get back in. And so, we did pretty well with a very bad harbor.
Yeah, and actually what they usually did is they would take the ships down to New York, and that's where they would load them up. And then when they came back, they would be operating out of New York. They'd be built up here, but operating out of New York.
And I think, on one of your earlier points as well, a number of young people would go to California on these ships, and I pictured the mothers breaking into tears right here in Newburyport. But come to find out, a lot of them did go to Boston, where the big ships would leave.
Right. Yeah.
So,
and probably some of the mothers, they probably had mixed feelings.
Well,
of course, this was the way to make it, in the 1800s. If you worked your way up to become captain of a ship or a ship owner, then you'd have one of these beautiful captain's houses on High Street.
Yeah, and it's curious, we mentioned 1790 to 1810. Most of the really big, beautiful houses today were built in that period.
Yeah.
And I did a story on it once. I was with the Daily News here in Newburyport, 1805, 1806, 1807, because I was kind of between the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. So we had less belligerency on the high seas, I think, and a lot of trade went on.
Yeah.
And so that was...
And a certain amount of pirate activity, I think, too.
There was as well. Go ahead.
I was going to say, of course, the other aspect of that era is you had the China trade. And it's kind of interesting because we're sort of in the same situation now that we were then, because we didn't have anything that China wanted. They had tea, they had porcelain, they had silk, they had all these luxury items that we wanted. The only thing they wanted from us was silver. So actually what we did is we then started importing poppy seeds and opium from India to China to get people in China addicted to opium. And then we had a trade item, and then finally China put their foot down on that, and it was actually Caleb Cushing from Newburyport who was the who negotiated the treaty that as we say it opened up trade to China, as the Chinese look at it very, very differently, and I think that's the reason they're still sensitive and concerned about losing face over trade with the United States. Still, that's most people here don't know anything about the Opium War, but they remember it because we caused millions of their citizens to become addicted to opium.
Well, our ship makers did make money in awkward ways. Opium was one, slavery was another.
Yeah.
It's supposedly we did not have any captains of industry here who actually ran slave ships and a slave business out of Newburyport. But builders here built many vessels that they knew were going to be used in the slave trade, sold them to England, to France. And so we did have a significant part in the slave trade.
Right.
And I believe there was some great research from a woman. She just spoke in town. She went to, this was her master's for Fitchburg State, and she found out that there were 2,200 slaves were carried over here in the century between 1750 and 1850 in ships built in Newburyport. And I felt just to ferret out that information was quite remarkable.
Right. Yeah.
Now, the notion of slavery in Newburyport doesn't catch on very easily because I have noticed that people, are a little reluctant to learn more about it. But as you say, opium was a factor, and slavery was a factor. But, these were factors everywhere. I mean, as people say, can you judge Thomas Jefferson because he owned slaves? Well, it was a different period of time. And, there's a whole cottage industry on Jefferson now. But anyway, it is a curious thing. And one of the other things I would mention when we talked about people teary-eyed at the deck, at the port, the family of Stephen Bray at one time, he was a captain. His wife was one of the few women who went to sea. This is about 1850 or 1860. And so they go off on a trip, and they left two of their boys, 8 and 10, on the dock. And they said, we'll be back. And they took the daughter, who was 5, and she eventually wrote her memoirs. But, if you wanted a heart-moving scene about two little boys waving goodbye, when are you going to be back? Well, 2 or 3 years. But, you like your auntie and uncle, so we'll bring back postcards. Anyway, I just mentioned it because, it is a story indigenous to Newburyport.
I will mention one other incident that occurred on the Merrimack, and that was the Pine Tree Riot, and it actually happened the year before the Boston Tea Party. And at the time, it was a much bigger deal because people weren't that upset about tea. It was more symbolic, but they were about their pine trees because the Royal Navy had declared all pine trees larger than 12 inches in diameter were considered the king's trees, and it was illegal to cut them down because they were going to be used for the Royal Navy masts. And anyway, the governor, the English governor, found a couple sawmills in New Hampshire that had the king's trees, and he sent a delegation up there. And there was one Ebenezer Mudgett who owned one of the sawmills, and he decided he wasn't going to put up with this. And he and about 20 associates dressed up and covered their face with soot and dragged the people out of the inn and rode them out of town, beating them with pine sticks. And of course, that didn't get into the history books because the people involved weren't as prominent as the people in the Boston Tea Party. And I think they didn't have, today we would be buying Ebenezer Mudgett ale, and I don't think it would go over as well as Sam Adams ale.
Well, it's a name that's hard to forget once it's in your mind. But, I'm Dyke Hendrickson. This is Life Along the Merrimack. I'm with Bill Sargent, an author. And, Bill, it's always good to talk to you. I learn a lot. I think our listeners will learn a lot. Do you have a project going on right now that you're going to be working on for the next year or so? You alluded to it, but maybe you can talk a little more about it.
I'm always superstitious about talking what I'm working on because you'll be a jerk if the book never gets written. But I am starting to look into this whole idea that ticks were being weaponized in the 60s, and that's the reason that we're having all the tick diseases that we're having now. And it kind of makes a lot of sense because there were a lot of questions that we just had that, I remember growing up, you would spend every night picking all the dog ticks off of your dogs, right. And nobody ever got sick, and all you found were the dog ticks. Now you never find a dog tick. They're all deer ticks, and people are picking up all these really horrible diseases. And as it turned out, in the 60s, we had plans to use biological weapons to invade Cuba. And actually, they had a big swimming pool full of toxins down in Pine Bluffs, Arkansas. And they were going to spray that over the island, and then everybody would get the worst flu you could imagine, and no one would be able to pick up a gun, and you'd be able to, take over the whole island. And they also had an incident where there was a new recruit, and he was told that he had a special classified mission. They didn't tell him what it was, and they put him on an airplane, and he was flying over Georgia, and then they said, okay, now open the box in front of you and dump it out. And he opened up the box, and it was teeming with ticks. And
well, Bill, this is fascinating. It sounds like it might be a bit difficult to research. How far along are you?
I actually, I'm fairly far along. I actually wrote a book a number of years ago called The Vaccine Chronicles. It never got published. It was right after 9/11, and it was right out, when the anthrax mailings were being done. And I've never had a book that was turned down, and I'm always suspicious why this was turned down. Maybe I didn't write it very well, but I think it was touching on some nerves. Because all of the anthrax vaccine that the United States Army was depending on for the invasion of Iraq, do you know where it came from?
I don't know.
It was a single horse, a single mare.
Wow.
And they would, infect her with the anthrax and then get the vaccine from that single horse.
Well, this is good. I mean, it's certainly an ambitious project. Now, they say Emily Dickinson wrote every night between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. You write a lot, you research a lot.
I write between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m., okay. So I would have been on the next shift.
Well, and it was curious. I just saw that movie with Cynthia Nixon a year or two ago, and, she had difficulty in the household, and she felt from 3 to 5 a.m. These are my times.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great, Bill. We're just about out of time. I want to thank you very much for being here. Thank the audience for staying with us. And this is Life Along the Merrimack. We talk about the health and history of the river. And we look forward to seeing your new book, which is about the Merrimack River. And how many words do you think that is, Bill? Is that about 20 to 40,000 words?
I haven't counted.
Well, I came up through newspapers, and everything you wrote, the editor would ask, okay, how many words is this? But anyway, Bill has a new book on the Merrimack River. Please go out and look at it. And so that's going to do it for us today. Bill, thank you very much again.
Thank you very much for having me. This was fun.
Okay, thank you very much.